All right, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alyssa Karpenka, and I'm the event coordinator for McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. Just to note that this event is being live streamed, so please be aware of the webcam to your right. I'd also like to take this moment to encourage you to silence your phones for the duration of the event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Saskatoon launch of The Duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada by John Ibbitson, and published by McClelland Stewart. Thank you to John for being here tonight and to Shauna Cook for working with us to create this event. John Ibbitson is one of Canada's best known and most respected journalists and authors. Since arriving in 1999 at the Globe and Mail, he has served as Washington Bureau Chief, Ottawa Bureau Chief, Chief Political Writer, and since 2015, Writer at Large. John currently serves as the General Editor of the Globe History Project, a series of historical essays exploring the newspaper's influence on Canadian history, which will be published by McClelland Stewart in 2024. He lives and writes in Ottawa. I'll now turn things over to John. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you to all for coming out tonight and to listening in on watching it online. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about The Duel. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about The Duel. I have been living this book for 4 years and attesting my friends and my relationships, especially with my husband, during the course of it. And I actually get to show you the book and talk to you a bit about why I wrote it. And why it means so much to me. And I do say it means so much to me. I had my first play published when I was 19, and I've been working ever since. I don't think anything gave me as much pleasure as working on The Duel. I have to edit a little bit, but there's a phrase that we use in book writing. It's called, "I'm working on my new book. I'm working on my book. I'm working on the blankety blank book." I never had that. It was always just a great pleasure, even though I was writing it in and around my duties as Globe and Mail, which are formidable in and of themselves. It was just a great pleasure to be able to immerse myself in these time and in the lives of these two men. And why these two men? Why a dual biography? I mean, how many dual biographies do you know of? There are very few out there. In fact, I know of a couple. The one that inspired me was, and I read it like 30 years ago, a joint biography of Gladstone and Disraeli, the 19th century British prime ministers. And I wanted to do it as a dual biography for a couple of reasons. The first was I wanted to do a reassessment of John Diefenbaker's prime ministership. I don't know about you, but Renegade in Power, Peter Newman's biography of John Diefenbaker, which came out in 1963, the year he was defeated, was a brilliantly written and utterly savage description of his years as prime minister. Newman portrayed him as dithering, bombastic, indecisive, paranoid, and as a result of which his government staggered from one disaster to another. Whenever he did make a decision, such as to cancel the Avro Aero, it was a wrong decision. By the way, it was not a wrong decision. It was the right decision. And somebody's going to ask me to explain that, I hope. But that's what I grew up with. And I think it's the entrenched wisdom about the Diefenbaker years. But as a journalist over the 3 decades now, I found that if I was researching a particular policy area, every now and then, surprisingly, I'd go, oh, that was launched by the Diefenbaker government. Oh, that happened on the Diefenbaker watch. And I began to suspect that maybe there was more to the Diefenbaker government than we had been led to believe. At least we of us in central Canada had been led to believe. And so I wanted to take a look at that and see to what extent we could revisit and revise the Diefenbaker years. But I didn't want to do it at the expense of Lester Pearson, because the narrative is, of course, Diefenbaker did all, useless, terrible, rotten, it was a total mess. And then Lester Pearson came along and gave us Medicare and the Canada Pension Plan, and the flag and all these other good things. And there's truth in that. But much of what the Pearson government achieved, it achieved on the shoulders of what Diefenbaker and his governments had launched. But I didn't want to get into a zero-sum game. I didn't want to diminish the Pearson government by trying to elevate the Diefenbaker government. So I thought that was one reason you should try to tell the story of the two men. And the other reason was it's just such a good story. I mean, we have never had in this country's history a time when for an entire decade, from 1957 to 1968, really, two men, one the leader of the Liberal Party, one the leader of the Conservative Party, fought each other relentlessly on the floor of the House of Commons during 4 different elections for power and control, and came to quite despise each other in the process. So I just wanted to tell that good tale, that really fun tale. And then there was a third thing that I wanted to do as well. These two men were born in Victorian Ontario, when this country was little more than a colony, far from sovereign, a so-called self-governing dominion, not all that self-governing in many areas as well. They fought over the disposition of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. That is how their lives, that was the arc of their lives, and it was the arc of this country's life. So that by the time they both had stepped down during and after Centennial, the Canada that we know was already largely in place. The modern Canada, the Canada of the welfare state, the Canada of public health care and pensions and universal public education and all the other things that we take for granted, those governments established. And so it was also a history of the country from the 1890s to the 1960s, especially a history of the country in the 50s and 60s, which I think was a bit of a dark age in terms of Canadian understanding of history. We know a lot about Confederation, at least those of us who care about Canadian history know a lot about Confederation. We know about our role in the 2 world wars. We know about the Depression. And then nothing happened between 1945 and the arrival of Pierre Trudeau. We just all sat around waiting for, Trudeau to arrive. But of course, that wasn't the case. It was a time of tremendous ferment and creativity. So I wanted to look at that as well. And that is what I set out to do. And that's what I hope this book achieves. When I say that Diefenbaker established many of the foundations of the policies that Lester Pearson incorporated into his governments. What do I mean by that? Let me give you 2 examples that I think are instructive. The first is immigration. Up until 1957, the most racist place in Canada was the Department of Immigration. It was the purpose of the Department of Immigration to keep Canada white. For many decades, there were explicit policies in place, head taxes and legislative bans that prohibited people who weren't European, especially Northern European, Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, all right, if we have to, but absolutely no other than that, to be allowed into the country. And although if you told this to a Gen Z today, they would find it astonishing. Diefenbaker suffered a lot of prejudice because of his last name. His last name was German. He wasn't British. He wasn't French. He was actually the first prime minister who was not from the original settler, founding nations. And so he brought Ellen Fairclough, by the way, the first woman cabinet minister, was appointed by John Diefenbaker, and he put in immigration with a mandate to clean it up. And it took a long time. She essentially had to dismantle the senior ranks of the department and put new people in place. But in January of 1962, she rose in the House of Commons and announced the new order in council that had just been enacted. And that order in council declared that for the first time in this country's history, where you came from, the color of your skin, your religion, your background, none of those things mattered anymore. You would be judged on your ability to contribute to the life of Canada. And that would be it. That was a great achievement. That was the first day of multicultural Canada, the day that Ellen Fairclough rose in the House of Commons to declare an end to race-based immigration. But it was just an order in council. These things can be subject to abuse. So when Pearson came in, he decided, or his government decided, on the need for something more established, more entrenched. Because you could still find that even with the order in council, the visa applications in London got processed a lot faster than visa applications in Delhi. So you needed something in place to eliminate that. And they came up with, actually Tom Kent and a couple of others, his assistant, came up with the point system. And I've argued in the past in books that the point system is Canada's greatest gift to the world. It is the means by which any country that so chooses can open itself up to a truly non-race-based immigration system, and one that will most likely both improve the life of the country and limit any kind of tensions between various ethnic groups as a result, because everybody's there working hard, making the place better. So there you had immigration, the principle of race-blind immigration, put forward by the Diefenbaker government, and then the sort of the codification of that practice through the point system in the Pearson governments. And those two policies together gave us the multicultural, diverse Canada that we live in today. One of the most important things that ever happened in this country after the Second World War. Let me give you one more. Healthcare. Of course, Lester Pearson is known as the father of Medicare. And in some respects, that's true, but not all. John Diefenbaker actually implemented universal public hospital care. Until then, if you needed a surgery and you didn't have private insurance, and very few people did, and you couldn't afford it, you might have to rely on charity, or you might have to make severe financial sacrifices in order to pay for the medical costs. Diefenbaker implemented a policy in cooperation with the provinces, of course, in which no one had to arrive at an emergency ward in a panic, and no one had to decide on whether or not to have that operation, because that operation was going to be paid for out of a universal public fund. Now, of course, we all know John Diefenbaker was from Saskatchewan, and Tommy Douglas was the premier of Saskatchewan. So he took the money and expanded it to create Medicare. Diefenbaker didn't feel he had a mandate to attempt a national Medicare program. He hadn't campaigned on it, and it's a pretty big policy to try to implement if you haven't campaigned on it. So he appointed a Royal Commission. Who did he appoint as the chair of the Royal Commission? Emmett Hall, his good buddy. They had been to law school together. They practiced in Saskatchewan together for years. Diefenbaker had elevated Hall to the Supreme Court. So he knew full well when he appointed Hall to chair that commission exactly what Emmett Hall was going to recommend. It happened, though, that by the time Hall got the report out, Pearson was the prime minister. Pearson implemented the Hall report. But I think if you're going to talk about the arrival of Medicare, the system that we have today, with all of its strengths and weaknesses, you have to talk about universal public health hospital care, replaced by universal public health care, essentially primary care, as a result of a commission that Diefenbaker stacked with his good buddy Emmett Hall. So again, those are two areas, and I could do others. I might just, because I'm talking too fast. There is one area in particular that I think we need to look at, and that is on the issue of human rights. Again, Lester Pearson fully deserves full credit for brokering the peace deal in the Middle East during the Suez Crisis. He earned him the Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, in this horrible time that we've been living in for the last couple of weeks, Pearson chaired the United Nations Commission panel in 1947 or 48 that recommended two states in that region, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. If only that recommendation had come to fruition, none of what we're going through, we might be going through today. And so, as well as literally inventing peacekeeping, he was also a huge champion of international aid. He went to Colombo during the talks that became known as the Colombo Plan. He, more than other Western leaders, was first out of the gate saying that Canada needed to substantially increase its contributions to what is now called the developing world. He was Minister of External Affairs at the time, and he used to say that getting the Saint Laurent cabinet to approve money for foreign aid was the hardest thing he ever did in public life. But he got it done. And of course, as Prime Minister as well, he helped to diffuse, or at least lower the temperature on the crisis in Cyprus by putting Canadian peacekeepers on the Green Line between the Turks and the Greeks. Those are all major achievements of which anyone who's studying Lester Pearson would want to which they would want to point. But Diefenbaker had human rights achievements of his own. He was, for example, the Prime Minister who delivered the vote for First Nations. He had grown up on a not very prosperous farm. Actually, it failed. Surrounded by many Métis and First Nations people. As a lawyer, you know, Diefenbaker for the defense. He made a good living up there in Prince Albert, but he was the attorney who would come to the rescue of anyone who was being railroaded by the justice system and needed a good lawyer. The wealthy, he said, have minions without number. They don't need help inside a court of law. But there are people inside a court of law who need a good lawyer and wouldn't get one unless someone like John Diefenbaker was available. And he always made himself available. And so First Nations obtained the right to vote in 1960. There was another thing he did that was in some ways both a human rights thing and just a very canny deal. The Chinese were starving. The Great Leap Forward was one of the great humanitarian disasters of the age. Millions died of starvation. And the Americans, who didn't even recognize the existence of this place, would do nothing. The Chinese needed wheat. Canada had a lot of wheat. And the Liberal governments in the previous decades had been rather indifferent to working with prairie farmers to help sell their wheat. Diefenbaker, Alvin Hamilton, his agriculture minister to be specific, arranged a deal to sell a very large amount of wheat to the Chinese. The Americans were so furious that they tried to keep American ships from loading the wheat or even using American cranes to load the wheat. But eventually they had to relent. That wheat saved a great many lives. It also was very good for prairie grain farmers. And Diefenbaker himself acknowledged that in some ways he was recognizing China before anyone was prepared to recognize China. If you sell them wheat, and by the way, provide them with the bridge loans that they need in order to pay for the wheat, you're in essence saying Ottawa and Beijing deal country to country with each other. And then, of course, his greatest achievement was the Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1960. He had fought for it his whole life. He fought for it since the 1940s. And it was his signature accomplishment. And sadly, the Supreme Court, in essence, gutted it, decided that it was simply one piece of legislation among others and had no precedence over any other piece of legislation. But as Rosalie Abella, the retired Supreme Court Justice, told me in the book, it was still a major achievement because it put the human rights agenda on the agenda. Canadians began talking to themselves, well, what rights do we have? What rights should we have? How are those rights protected? Are we going to just trust the common law and the unwritten constitution to preserve those rights? Parliament has been known to commit abuses. Maybe we need something codified. It's ironic that after he was out of power, Pierre Trudeau and Diefenbaker got along quite well. Trudeau had him over 24 Sussex Drive for lunch. Now, part of that was because their favorite topic was trashing Bob Stanfield. But the other part of it was that Trudeau was trying to get a Bill of Rights incorporated into a patriotic constitution. And Diefenbaker had started that ball rolling with his Bill of Rights. And finally, you'll remember maybe in 1980, though, well, you have to be old as me to remember it. But in 1980, Nelson Mandela, not long after he was freed from prison, came to Canada, speak to the Parliament, and to thank Canada for its resolute opposition to apartheid. And he thanked Brian Mulroney, and then he thanked John Diefenbaker, because as he rightly pointed out, Diefenbaker was the first Western leader to voice his opposition to apartheid and to refuse essentially to allow South Africa to remain inside the Commonwealth unless and until it dismantled apartheid. It earned the rage of the British and Australian prime ministers, by the way, because they exactly what they predicted happened. South Africa withdrew its application to be readmitted into the Commonwealth, and we're gone ever since. But it was Mandela who remembered that, and Brian Mulroney who would tell you that his stalwart opposition to apartheid and Joseph Clark's solid opposition to apartheid was inspired by John Diefenbaker when they were young university students watching the Progressive Conservative government fight for the rights of Black South Africans. So again, both men deserve credit for those achievements. We can go on about justice reform in many ways. The penal system was fundamentally reformed under Diefenbaker. Also, there was a great rebuilding of prisons. The National Parole Board was created. The ethos that prison should be a place of reformation and not just punishment was established, again, carried on. Diefenbaker increased pensions substantially. Lester Pearson enacted the Canada Pension Plan. Diefenbaker expanded supports for post-secondary education. Pearson government came up with the Canada Student Loan Program. This getting boring now, isn't it? So I'll stop, but I'm trying to make the point that just in terms of policy, we really do need to reassess the Diefenbaker government and think of it as a continuum of Diefenbaker and Pearson years, rather than there being some great cleavage. Both of them would raise their eyebrows at this thesis because they hated each other so much. And it's actually, even that is an overstatement. I don't think Diefenbaker hated Pearson. When Pearson was External Affairs Minister and Diefenbaker was External Affairs critic, and we don't need to get into the details, but the Americans were launching a witch hunt against a Canadian diplomat. Pearson was doing everything in his power, as it turned out, futilely, to protect that diplomat. And Pearson, as critic, was urging Pearson to go as far as he needed to go to tell the Americans that they may not interfere, and indeed got a letter from across the aisle thanking him. So at that stage, they liked and respected each other. But look, two angels who spent 10 years fighting each other in the House of Commons for power were not going to be the best of friends at the end of those 10 years. And indeed, Pearson despised Diefenbaker, called him a clown. And there was a reason for it. Diefenbaker had made Pearson's life utterly miserable. I think in some ways, Pearson was happier in opposition. That does not diminish how much he wanted to be prime minister and enjoyed being prime minister, but he lived to be on the floor of the House of Commons with this stance and, some quivering, quailing liberal minister or prime minister, at the butt of his wrath. Nothing gave him more pleasure. And of course, and as Pearson always said, he never thought of himself as a politician. He was a diplomat. He was a mandarin. He was an external affairs person. He knew nothing about politics and nothing about domestic policy, and had little appetite to learn. So when he became prime minister, many of the accomplishments of his government and his government were the accomplishments of his ministers, but the governments were also racked by scandal. Oh my God, the scandals. Canada has lost the ability to do great scandals. We were once a proud scandal-creating country. The country that could hold its head up high and say, you think you can do scandals? Wait till you see the Lucien Rivard affair. Wait till you see the Gerda Munsinger affair. We'll show you what a good scandal looks like. Today, nothing. And I say that with all due respect to my good friends Bob Fife and Steve Chase, who have brought down a couple of governments in their time. I'm going to, in fact, I've just a second made a decision. I have been going back in my mind over which of the two book excerpts I should offer you. And I'm going to offer you both, just because I can't make up my mind. And so you'll get a sense of one of the scandals, the Munsinger affair. Raise your hands if you have any remembrance of the Munsinger affair. Well, good for you. I mean, I was vague in my head when I started to delve into it. There were lots of times in this book I was going, oh my God, you're kidding me. Is this real? And indeed it was. I'll tell you about the Rivard affair first, though. So Rivard was Lucien Rivard was a Montreal mobster, and he was languishing in a Montreal prison. The Americans wanted him extradited to the United States for heroin charges. And the lawyer representing the United States government was summoned to Ottawa on an urgent matter. He arrived. And he was told it would be useful if he did not oppose Rivard's application for bail. And he said, why on earth would I not oppose the application for bail? He'll skip the country if you let him out. And they said, yes, well, maybe that will happen or maybe that won't happen. Who could say? But we would be grateful. And he said, well, why? And he said, well, it's in the book. I swear to God, there are footnotes. Mr. Rivard and his associates have been very generous to the Liberal Party. And we have reason to believe that they would be even more generous to the Liberal Party if he were granted bail. And there are several $1,000s in it for you if you agree. And beyond that, Government of Canada issues a lot of lawyerly business, which may come your way or may not come your way, depending on whether you oppose bail. The lawyer, Lamontagne, went straight to the police. Before long, it was all out on the House of Commons floor. And the RCMP were investigating, eventually they criminal charges. The judicial inquiries were fast and furious during the Pearson years, because that's all Pearson could do was say, oh, geez, judicial inquiry. But it didn't end there. Brevard, in one warm March evening, requested permission to go out and water the skating rink for the prison. He was granted permission. He went out, he threw the hose over the fence and escaped from the prison, where he then was on the lam for months, sending letters to the press and to Pearson and to others, deriding them for their incompetence. And of course, Diefenbaker he was in love with this. He used to go to during rallies. He would say, "You'll forgive me if I take out my jacket. Why? It was almost as warm tonight as it was the evening they let Lucien Brevard out to water the skating rink." So what I'd like to do, and in fact, yes, I guess I better do it because I am running out of time. I'm going to read you the preface. It's not long, and the preface is the very last thing a writer writes in a book like this. I think most writers would tell you the same thing. The preface is, you've written the book, you've spent your 4 years on it in this case. Now, what do you think of it? And the preface is how you both tease the reader, so I have purpose here, into buying the book. And also sum up the major themes of the book. And I'm going to do that. And I think we have time. I'm going to do the Monsignor affair. That's okay. Because it's just so good. So here is the preface to the Duel. On Sunday, August 19th, 1979, just before the beginning of the state funeral in the nation's capital for John George Diefenbaker, a senior official came to the Prime Minister, Joe Clark, with news of a bomb threat. It might be necessary, he was advised, to evacuate 1,200 politicians, judges, ambassadors, and other dignitaries from Christchurch Cathedral and cancel the service. The decision was the Prime Minister's to make. Clark looked around at the rows of political eminences. He pointed to the casket. The only one who wants us all dead is lying right up there. Let's carry on. Diefenbaker had spent 3 years planning his funeral, which included his casket taking a 3,000-kilometer train ride, escorted by friends and family and reporters, back to Saskatoon, where Canada's 13th Prime Minister would be buried. Although the only scheduled stops were in Sudbury, Winnipeg, and Prince Albert, people gathered along the route to mark his passing. Sometimes just a few at a dirt road crossing, or a family at harvest in the field, standing silently in tribute. Quote, workmen holding hard hats in their hands as the train went by, the Globe and Mail's Joan Olivan wrote. Old men standing at attention, women waving, young people. But also crowds lining the track as the train passed through towns and cities. 10,000 waited past midnight in Winnipeg. Canada's first and most populous Prime Minister was resented by the leadership of both the Liberal and Progressive Conservative parties, and the feeling was mutual. But he was still loved by the people he had fought, who welcomed him home. John Diefenbaker has been unfairly treated by history. His governments launched major reforms to healthcare, immigration, the justice system. On his watch, First Nations obtained the right to vote, and the federal government began to open up the North. He established Canada as a leader in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, and took the first steps in making Canada a leader in the fight against the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights laid the groundwork for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which might not have been needed had the Supreme Court not disregarded Diefenbaker's bill. These and other achievements were obscured by his baffling conduct, his suspicions and vanity and vendettas, and by a cadre of historians and journalists who are always more comfortable when Liberals are in charge. To work, gentlemen, we have a government to bring down, Toronto Star reporter Val Sears memorably declared in the press gallery on the day of the 1963 election call. That same year, journalist Peter C. Newman considerably advanced his career with Renegade in Power, the Diefenbaker Years, a brilliantly written but vicious assault. Despite the personal demons that he battled, Diefenbaker set in motion many of the achievements credited to his successor, That's to be Pearson. Pearson, in turn, gave coherence to Diefenbaker's piecemeal reforms. He also pushed Parliament to adopt a new and much-loved Canadian flag against Diefenbaker's fierce opposition. Pearson understood that in the post-war world, Canada's attachment to Great Britain must give way to the reality of American power, that if Canada were to be taken seriously as a nation, it needed to develop a stronger sense of self. Diefenbaker's parochial vision remained rooted in nostalgia for the empire. He raged as Canada grew beyond the limits of that imagination. Both men grappled with Quebec's quiet revolution, neither truly understood. Pearson was superbly prepared for the role of prime minister. Decades of experience at external affairs, the respective leaders from Washington to London to Delhi to Tokyo, the only Canadian to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And Pearson possessed none of Diefenbaker's paranoia. He was a decent and honorable man. Diefenbaker was a better politician, though. If Pearson walked with ease in the halls of power, Diefenbaker connected with the farmers and small town merchants and others left outside the inner circles. Diefenbaker was one of Canada's great orators, one of the greatest in our political life. Pearson spoke with a slight lisp. And though Pearson thought he could better manage relations with the United States during the tumultuous 1960s, he ended as estranged from Lyndon Johnson as Diefenbaker became from John F. Kennedy. Most of Diefenbaker and Pearson's biographers have focused on foreign affairs, scandals, the struggle for national unity, and the enmity of each toward the other. But while the Bullmark missile crisis and the Gerda Munsinger affair have faded from popular memory, public health care, and enlightened immigration policy, pensions, civil rights define the social fabric of this country. These are the true legacies of Diefenbaker and Pearson, the things for which both prime ministers deserve to be praised and remembered. Their growth was Canada's growth. Both were born in small-town Ontario, one the son of a teacher, the other of a preacher, when Canada was a semi-colonial backwater with no voice in the world. While the Pearsons remained rooted in southern Ontario, however much they moved around within it, the Diefenbakers migrated to Saskatchewan when John was still a boy, a cleavage that defined his life. Both served in the First World War, and why neither saw combat makes for two fascinating tales, and prospered in a post-war, post-prohibition Canada, where women had the vote and a maturing Dominion took greater control over its own affairs. Diefenbaker came first to public notice as a crusading attorney. Diefenbaker for the defense, champion of the little man or woman caught in a legal vice and desperately in need of a good lawyer. R.V. Olson, R.V. Bahar, R.V. Emile fight over Grayall's estate. Most famous of all, the defense of John Atherton, telegraph operator accused of negligence leading to a train wreck and the death of 21 men. Diefenbaker won acquittal by arguing that the railway was the true culprit, though in other cases, victory meant saving his client from the gallows. Pearson at first seemed fated to spend his life playing and coaching sports well and teaching history indifferently. But he caught the attention of the men who were shaping Canada's first true Department of Foreign Affairs. As the Roaring Twenties gave way to Dust Bowl and Depression, and then to yet another great war, he rose to prominence as a masterful diplomat, the embodiment of a new country that had earned its place on the battlefield in the councils of nations. Ambassador, undersecretary, minister, peacemaker. Everyone knew he was destined to be prime minister. But in 1957, destiny took a turn. Then they faced each other, Diefenbaker v. Pearson, across the House of Commons, leaders of their parties, each determined to wrest and hold power in a decade-long contest that would shake and shape the country. Here is a tale of two men, children of Victoria, who led Canada into the atomic age, each the product of his past, each more like the other than either would ever admit, fighting each other relentlessly while together forging the Canada we live in today. Their story is the story of Canada's transformation from a rural religious appendage of British Empire to an urban multi-ethnic middle power embracing its centennial year. To understand our times, we must first understand theirs. Now, I should just be quiet, but I just can't help letting you have a peek at the Munsinger affair. I won't read all of it because most of the chapter, but I can skip, I think, over certain paragraphs. So the second Pearson government, so the first Pearson government was one scandal after another scandal after another scandal. Free living room furniture to letting a mobster leave the country. Now, all the other stuff was going on, the stuff that we remember. But if you were living in those years, you were more obsessed with how Pearson could have so many corrupt ministers at one time. He decided to go to the people in 1965 because his advisors and pollsters assured him that he could get a majority government. And if he could get a majority government, he could shut down all this noise from the opposition. But as he himself admitted, he was terrible on the campaign trail. And so he was limited. And Diefenbaker still had this bond with the people. And so he was limited to a second minority government. And guess what? Yet more scandals. And they were right in the middle of another one about some poor, sad guy in the post office who was passing secrets to the Soviets. Nothing that you couldn't have found, by the way, without by looking in the phone book. However, once again, the House was in a terrible state. And the Justice Minister was Cardin was not able to handle what was going on, and he was getting more and more flustered. And Diefenbaker was, pounding his fist, and he wanted another inquiry into this latest, the Spencer affair, into the spy. And he's in the House of Commons. Has there been a failure of security in the Spencer case? Or had Spencer been unfairly maligned by the Minister of Justice? An inquiry, Mr. Speaker, the government must hold an inquiry. Cardin declared, the great execution is now after my political neck. You committed suicide yourself, Diefenbaker countered. Cardin accused Diefenbaker of undermining trust in government with wild and baseless accusations. Diefenbaker responded that it was Cardin and the Liberals who were undermining public trust by stonewalling on the Spencer case. The House went from raucous to silent. Sign that things have become deadly. Cardin. The right honourable gentleman was accusing us of hiding the truth, of hiding evidence from the committee. Well, I can tell the right honourable gentleman that of all the members of the House of Commons, I repeat, he is the very last person in this House who can afford to give advice on the handling of security cases in Canada. Reporters in the gallery glanced at each other. What was Cardin talking about? What had the Diefenbaker government kept hidden? Diefenbaker noted that Pearson was applauding. I want that on the record. I understand the right honourable gentleman said he wants that on the record, Cardin responded. Would you want me to go on and give more? Go on, he wants it, MPs yell. Very well, Cardin answered. I want the right honourable gentleman to tell the House about his participation in the Monsignor case when he was the Prime Minister of this country. I'm not worried, Diefenbaker shot back. Have your commission look into it. Put it on the agenda. Reporters charged out of the press gallery to alert their editors. Something big had broken, Fraser Kelly of the Toronto Telegram told his desk. Cardin is accusing Diefenbaker of a cover-up when he was Prime Minister, something involved with a Monsignor. Blair Fraser of McLean's, who knew things he chose not to report, spoke softly into Kelly's ear. Fraser, it's Monsignor. It was out. Gerda Hessler was born in what was then East Prussia in 1929. Like millions of other Germans, she fled west when the Russians occupied the territory in 1944. Strikingly good-looking, self-possessed, and intelligent, Hessler did what she needed to do to survive, which included petty theft and prostitution, and perhaps a bit of spying for the communists. She also learned English and married Michael Munsinger, an American serviceman, as part of her unremitting campaign to immigrate either to the United States or Canada. Her applications were refused because of her criminal record and allegations of moral turpitude. Finally, in 1955, she gained admission to Canada using her married name, although the couple had amicably annulled their marriage. Once in Canada, she settled in Montreal, working as a cashier in rather shady nightclubs and perhaps selling her services. By 1959, Monsignor was 30, enjoying life to the full and carrying on an affair with Pierre Sevigny, Diefenbaker's Associate Minister of National Defense. She also dined with George Hees, who later insisted things never went any further, though his grin when he made that claim to reporters suggested otherwise. With Sevigny's help, Monsignor applied in 1960 for a Canadian passport. While vetting the application, the RCMP discovered her maiden name, her previous application, her checkered past, and the nature of her relationship with Sevigny. Police informed Justice Minister Davy Fulton, who informed Diefenbaker, who ordered Sevigny to end the affair, which he did. Monsignor returned to Germany in 1963, and that was that, or so it seemed. The next year, Pearson, who was beside himself with frustration at all of these scandals, asked the RCMP to send in the files of anything untoward that had happened when Diefenbaker was prime minister. And they sent him the Munsinger files. So he sends a note to Pearson saying, I've been made aware of this grave breach of national security. I am most alarmed about the implications. I need to hear from you immediately about what you have done to protect our nation from this clear and present danger. Rather than replying formally, Diefenbaker visited Pearson in person. The opposition leader was suffering from a cold. According to Pearson's diary, he went on, quote, about the heartbreak and difficulties of being a PM before coming to the point. He knew about Sevigny and Munsinger, but took no action against his minister on the grounds that national security had not been compromised. He also alluded, he goes on about the Spencer case. The conversation becomes heated. Diefenbaker in his memoirs said Pearson, in the most ingratiating way, said, we should not talk to each other like this, John, and insisted he was not a politician, but a diplomat. We can't know everything that went on in that room, but we can imagine the tension as the two men confronted each other. Things go from bad to worse. Pearson decides to hold not one, but two royal commissions, one into the Spencer affair, one into the Munsinger affair. Cardin threatens to quit. The entire Quebec caucus is now threatening to quit with him. Pearson, using skills that previously were used in the United Nations, manages to hold the caucus together. Cardin holds a press conference to explain everything. Cardin held a press conference to clear the air about his threatened resignation and to explain what he meant by the Monsignor case. He told reporters about Olga, wrong name, Munsinger, including her affair with a certain unnamed Diefenbaker cabinet minister, adding that she had returned to Germany and reportedly had died of leukemia. It didn't take reporters long to figure out that Sevigny was the alleged guilty party. The former minister, his wife, and children by his side denied that his relationship with Munsinger was anything but platonic, and called Cardin a despicable, wanton little politician. Meanwhile, the Toronto Star's Robert Reguly had tracked down Munsinger in Berlin. She was very much alive, working as a waitress in a nightclub and happy to talk. Pearson called yet another judicial inquiry. It seemed as though Canada might be running out of judges. In the House of Commons, Pearson pulled no punches. The Conservatives had tarred and feathered one honourable Liberal cabinet minister after another, he fumed. Now these gentlemen who have been so free with their accusations over the past few years are getting a little bit of it, and they don't like it. So it was really about nothing more than the Liberals getting even. The Munsinger affair quickly eclipsed every scandal that had come before. Diefenbaker dismissed the inquiry as a travesty of the political process and disparaged Richard Spence, the Supreme Court Justice, who conducted it as a solid Liberal. In May, the Conservatives pulled the council from the inquiry, effectively boycotting it. In his report, released on September 23rd, Spence said although there was no evidence of any breach of security, Munsinger was clearly a security risk, if only because of her ties to the mob of Montreal, and Diefenbaker should have dismissed the minister. Diefenbaker ignored the report. When reporters asked Sevigny for his response, he said, the whole thing is bullshit. When told that word could not be used in print or on air, he responded, no, but how about horseshit? Munsinger herself delivered the final verdict. I knew Pierre as a man. He knew me as a woman. That's all there was to it. In the end, the Munsinger affair probably tarnished the Liberals more than the Conservatives by showing how desperate they were to distract attention from their own misdeeds. The Prime Minister admitted to Bruce Hutchison, a reporter, that he had raised Munsinger with Diefenbaker, hoping, quote, that if he was aware that I knew about it, the affair, he might take things a little easier on us. He must have hated what he had become. His biographer, John English, pronounced Liberal threats of doing unto the Conservatives as the Conservatives had done unto them, the nadir of Mike Pearson's public career. So that's it. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for allowing me to read those two excerpts. I am more than happy to answer any questions that you might have, and we'll start right there.
You had mentioned about the Avro Arrow. I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And again, it's part of the mythology around Diefenbaker, a very Laurentian mythology. So the Avro Arrow was a beautiful plane, incredibly advanced, twice the speed of sound, faster than any other plane in the world, on board a computer the first time ever, and gorgeous to look at. And it was at the heart of Canada's military aviation industry. And Diefenbaker wantonly, capriciously in the act of political vandalism, canceled the thing. Not only canceled it, but had all of the prototypes and the equipment and the machinery destroyed because, well, he was like that. And in doing so, he destroyed our aviation industry. He destroyed a beautiful plane, and people still get angry about the Avro Arrow. I mean, it doesn't take that long before somebody, usually on the CBC, will mention the Avro Arrow disaster. None of that is true. And there has never been a single informed analysis of the Avro Arrow that came to any other conclusion than Diefenbaker was right to do what he did. And how can we buttress that evidence? And this is one of the biggest surprises of the book for me. The San Laurent cabinet, in its last meeting before the 1957 election, decided to cancel the Avro Arrow. But they decided to wait until after the election before making the announcement. Everyone assumed they would win because the Liberals had won every election since the mountains were formed back then, with rare exceptions. But of course, they didn't win. Diefenbaker became prime minister, and he was stuck with the decision to announce the cancellation, which the Liberals had already made. And by the way, if you look at the record, Pearson criticizes Diefenbaker for the way he announced it and for the lack of thought he put into announcing it, for waiting too long to announce it. But he never criticized the decision, not once. He sat in a cabinet that made exactly the same decision. So why did they decide to cancel the Arrow? It's a great historical irony. On the very day that they rolled out the Avro Arrow's first prototype for public display, that was the day that the Russians launched Sputnik. And the day the Russians launched Sputnik, the Avro Arrow became obsolete. It was perfectly clear the purpose of Sputnik was not to send a satellite beating around the Earth. The purpose of Sputnik was to demonstrate that the Soviet Union had perfected an intercontinental ballistic missile. And there would only be a matter of time before warheads replaced the satellite. The Americans, of course, were close behind. And the whole purpose of the Arrow was to intercept bombers coming over the Arctic. There would be still some bombers coming over the Arctic, but that would not be the principal means by which the global thermonuclear exchange would be launched. It would be launched by ICBMs on land and by submarines. There was no purpose. There was a need for an interceptor, but there was no need for that particular interceptor. Why was there no need for that particular interceptor? Because it was such a cruel plane. Well, the Americans and the British and the French and every other country that had an aviation industry told Canada they had no intention of buying the Arrow. Can you imagine the Americans telling Boeing, give up your interceptor program, we're going to go with the Canadians, or the British or the French? That neither the San Laurent government nor the Diefenbaker government nor Avro could find anyone anywhere who was going to buy the plane.
No market anywhere.
No market for it anywhere. So you had a essentially, technically highly advanced, but strategically obsolete interceptor aircraft that could only be used by the Canadian Armed Forces, and that would be and that had been rejected by every other ally on the planet. And it was horrifically expensive. In fact, C.D. Howe, who never met $1 billion he didn't like, said that Avro was the only thing that actually gave him a heartburn because it was burning through so much money and with so little to show for it. So Diefenbaker made the right decision. Could he have made it better? Could he have worked with Avro, even though Gordon Crawford, who at that point already I think was an alcoholic, we refused to have any kind of meaningful conversations about transitioning to another aircraft, about working to find other jobs for the workers. Literally, the day that Diefenbaker made the announcement, they fired their entire workforce over the loudspeaker that afternoon. So it was a political disaster for Diefenbaker because, believe it or not, in those days, Toronto was a Tory bastion, but it wasn't after that. And also because he hadn't handled the announcement as well as he might have. But the announcement itself was sound. Diefenbaker made the right decision. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Anyone else? Oh, I see someone in the back. Yes.
I don't know if you can even hear me.
Oh, I can hear you fine.
Okay. Kind of a two-faceted question. Think globally, act locally for the two leaders. What were their contributions, the first part, to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights? And who in their governments was the architect which led to putting away Everett Clifford for perpetuity?
And those are great questions. I don't know if you know, but I wrote the story of Everett Clifford in 2016 that led to the apology in the House of Commons by the government. So I know exactly what you're talking about. The Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, I forgot his name. You probably know it. A Canadian held the pen on the Declaration of Human Rights, although Canada was not the major instigator of it. And in fact, at the beginning, Pearson, as minister, said that Canada might not sign the declaration. Why? Because many of the areas described in the Declaration of Human Rights were areas of provincial jurisdiction, and he didn't want to get into a Fed-Prov fight. But when he realized that every other country in the Western Alliance was signing the thing, he quickly changed his mind and Canada signed that. Everett Clifford, for those who don't understand, in the 1950s, just one second. Homosexuality had been legal since the late 1800s. It was a major felony. In the 1950s, during the height of the communist Red Scare, in the Sanarock government the RCMP essentially came to the Sanarock government and said, we want to conduct careful examination of especially people in the forces and people in external affairs to locate homosexuals. The theory was that homosexuals could be blackmailed, they could spill state secrets, also they were homosexuals. And so the Sanarock government launched that program. In a shadow of defense, when Diefenbaker came in, the clerk of the Privy Council, Robert Bryce, expressed his disquiet with the program and wanted to know if less drastic means could be employed, because the RCMP literally rounded up thousands of people and destroyed their lives and their careers. But it went on under the Diefenbaker government. It went on under the Pearson government and the Trudeau government. It came to a head with the case of Everett Clifford. Clifford was a bus driver in Calgary. He also liked hand jobs. And so he would hit up guys, and that's what they would give each other. It never went further than that. But somebody's father found out about it and went to the police. The police pulled in Clifford and said, it'll go better for it if you tell the truth. So he told the truth and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. When he got out, he went up north to Hay River. And one day the RCMP called him in. He wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer. I called him in and said, are you doing the same sort of things up here that you were doing down in Calgary? It'll be better for you if you tell the truth. So he told the truth, and they sentenced him again. I think it was this year to 5 years in prison. Well, I have to check those numbers. However, the Crown said, well, this is the second time he's been convicted for gross indecency. We should make him a designated sexual offender, which means a life sentence in prison. And the judge agreed. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court agreed. So, and on the day, and if I give you a little bit of autobiographical background, on the page 2 of the Globe and Mail, there's a thing called Moment in Time. And I love doing them. They're kind of intellectual puzzles because they only give you 200 words and you have to describe some big event and you have to have a thesis. You can't just say this, this, and this. And I kind of enjoy that. So they said hey, can you give us moment in time of the day that Pierre Trudeau said the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation? He said that on the day he introduced legislation to decriminalize private homosexual acts between two consenting adults. And that was the result of the Clifford decision. When the Supreme Court ruled, yes, a life sentence for sexual, as a repeat sexual offender is justified. Even people in Parliament thought that was outrageous. Now, Tommy Douglas, bless his heart, said that Everett Clifford was mentally ill and needed the help of a psychiatrist, but he shouldn't be languishing in prison. Nonetheless, the bill got passed, and I was just writing this moment in time, and saw this reference mention of a Supreme Court reference, but didn't need to put that in the moment in time, and on I went. But kind of a couple of days later was bugging me, oh, what Supreme Court references is about? Because I knew nothing about Edward Clifford. And I looked it up and I read the Supreme Court decision sentencing him to life. And I went, this is outrageous. They sentenced this man to life in prison for hand jobs. And I went to my boss, Bob Fife, the Ottawa bureau chief. And I said, we have to find out what happened to Clifford. Who was this guy? What happened after he got out? And Bob said, I think that's a great idea. He phoned David Walmsley, the editor-in-chief in Toronto, and David said, whatever you need for as long as you want. And it took us a couple of months, but we finally tracked down family members in Calgary. They were worried that we were doing some kind of hit job. I literally had to fly to Calgary and meet the family and explain to them, no, we don't do the very opposite. This man was subject to one of the great legal abuses of our time. And they eventually became very, very forthcoming. He was a lovely guy, their favorite uncle. By the way, the bill passed in '69. He didn't get out till '73. So he spent another 4 years in prison, even though it was no longer an illegal act that he had committed. And then when he got out, he found a permanently unmarried woman and they got married. And he wanted nothing to do with, was now the beginning of the gay rights movement. It died at the age of 76 in the 90s. So we got all of this. And I wrote 5,000 words on it. That's long even for the Globe and Mail. And I contacted the Prime Minister's office. Trudeau had only been in power at this point a few months, explained the whole story and said, we want to know if the Prime Minister would consider a pardon for Edward Clifford, posthumous pardon. And he said, well, it's all news to us. Can you give me a day? And gave him a day. And he came back and he said, not only would we be prepared to pardon Edward Clifford, we would be prepared to pardon everyone who was convicted of that crime. But we need to go through the files first. So now we had an even better story. And David in Toronto said, where do we go next? How do we keep going? And I said, well, this purge that they launched in the 50s, hundreds and hundreds of people lost their careers because of it. The last one, Michelle Douglas, was terminated for disadvantageously unemployable due to homosexuality in 1989. And she sued. And somebody rose in the House of Commons to ask Brian Mulroney, why are we still persecuting people who are gay in the Canadian Forces? And Mulroney essentially said, we are. And the government quickly dropped the case. So we then began writing stories about these people's lives, how they had been, promising careers, young people in the military, young people in foreign affairs, who'd been hauled in, put under the glare of the lights, forced to confess, and then discharged. And in many cases, some got over it and went on and had happy lives. Some never got over it. And ultimately, this ended in the fall of 2017 when Justin Trudeau rose in the House and first of all said not only a pardon, but an apology to everyone who had been convicted under those charges and to everyone who had been persecuted under those persecutions, along with the largest class action settlement in history for one of the largest in history. There's going to be a museum and other stuff as well. None of that has anything to do with John Diefenbaker and Lester Pearson, but sure gave me felt good to be able to tell it one more time. Thank you for that. And with that,
What happened to the Diefenbaker?
okay, 1 and 1. Yeah.
The Diefenbaker.
Oh, the Diefen baby. I have no idea whether it's true. It would have had to have happened when he and Oliver married. He and Oliver were happily married. He was well into his 60s. The DNA evidence is far from conclusive, but I don't know. It gets a paragraph in the book, and that's about as. The book is 161,000 words. It gets a paragraph, and that's how much it deserves, in my opinion. Sir.
Yeah, so the two you wrote about, they didn't exactly love each other. They critiqued each other, but they in a way kind of respected each other for their ideology, for their thoughts for making Canada a better place. I'm wondering that the two we have now, do you see them working together at all with different
That's
supporting good things for Canada.
well, I wrote an essay about that in the Globe a couple of weeks ago because the Globe asked me to write something about the Duel, and as you've just discovered, I will go on and on about this. I talked in the book about the fact that Diefenbaker was the first truly populist prime minister, but his populism was deeply rooted in his life story. He had grown up poor. They busted sod on the prairies, and they failed, and the families around them failed, and they talked bitterly about the grain merchants who would claim their wheat was wet when it wasn't, and pay them only a fraction of what they were worth. That was in him, and as I said, as a defense attorney, he's the only future prime minister that I know of who would sit in the cell and listen to a woman sobbing, explaining why she had buried her baby without telling her that the baby had died. He was the one who defended a woman who killed her husband because she said her husband would certainly have killed her first. Jury acquitted, by the way, in both those cases. And in Jack Atherton, a young man who was literally being railroaded by the CNR because the CNR said he didn't properly transcribe a telegram, and therefore two trains collided in the Rockies and 21 men were killed. He not only got Atherton off, but he essentially convicted the CNR of negligence for failing to install the proper signals, even though they'd been repeatedly warned they needed those signals. Diefenbaker's populism was rooted in himself. And I maintain in the book that a bond formed between the veteran, the railway worker, the guy with the hard hat, the homemaker. By the way, my parents and grandparents would have been very proud to be called part of that group. Who loved him, and he loved them back. Also, there was a deep consensus in the 1960s, not just in Canada, but in the United States, Britain, between Republicans and Democrats, or Labor and Conservatives. Government had won the war. Government had won the peace by preventing a depression, by bringing the servicemen back, giving them education and training and free health care, support for their first houses. They had essentially created the suburban middle class in the wake of the Second World War. So big government had won the war, big government had won the peace. And most people in the 60s would have said, don't stop. We want free education. We want free healthcare. And so there was whatever the two men thought of each other, there was a consensual approach to what government should do. That's why Diefenbaker could launch all of these things in his time, and Pearson could carry them on. We don't live in those times. We have a greater sense of polarization today than then. I don't think it's nearly as serious as it is today in Canada as it is in the United States, where Republicans can't even elect a speaker. So I think our consensual bonds remain stronger, though they're not as strong as they once were. And so I don't have an answer to what kind of a populist prime minister Pierre Poilievre would be. He would be our second populist prime minister. I've known him since 2004. I hope, and of course we don't know if he'll be prime minister, he just happens to be stratospherically ahead in the polls right now. I don't know what kind of a populist he would be. I hope he would be the kind of populist that John Diefenbaker was. As I wrote, John Diefenbaker never sought to tear down, he only sought to build up. And I hope Mr. Poilievre would live and walk in the footsteps of John Diefenbaker. I think that might be a good place to thank you all for coming out tonight and to say good night.
I'll just say a quick word before I let you go. I'd like to thank John again for being with us tonight. We have copies of the Duel on the desk to your right, and if you'd like your copy signed or if you'd like to say hello, John will be happy to meet you at the signing table. Thank you so much for coming out tonight, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Oh, good, thank you.